What's going on, everybody? Just living the fantasy life here. Ian Hartitz and your boy Dwain, the Rock McFarland. And my goodness, we have had a crazy week. Teams changing, obviously, with their trades, with their free agent signings. Rosters today looking far different than they did even a short 7 days ago. So, loaded show for you guys on tap again, just going through some of the biggest deals over the course of the last week and even over the last 24 hours. But first things first, Mr. Dwain, how's it going, man?
What is up, Mr. Hartitz? Things are going great. I did a crawfish boil yesterday, Ian. So, one of my favorite days of the year. So, yeah, I drank some beers. I ate some crawfish, hung out with some friends. Now I'm just ready to hang out with another buddy and talk some football.
Sounds like a great day to be great to meet, my friend. And also a pretty great day for one Jordan Mason, 49ers RB2. I know made the people a lot of money early on last year when Christian McCaffrey went down. He ran for all kinds of yards as Shanny's RB1. Now they'll join a member of the Minnesota Vikings. Relatively, little kind of trade compensation here. The 49ers are getting a 2026 six-rounder back and a pick swap, but the Vikings really getting the crown jewel of the deal, if you will, with one Jordan Mason. And they went ahead and signed him to a 2-year deal with over $7 million fully guaranteed, maximum value of $12 million. So, Dwayne, it's one of these things where when we're looking at running backs and they've only had 150 carries, it doesn't feel completely right to compare them to guys like Derrick Henry and Saquon when you look at them, again, putting up these sort of efficiency numbers on more than double the workload. But, man, looking at what Mason did during the first, 8 or so weeks of 2024 truly was impressive.
Yeah, he played well. I mean, he's honestly played well every time he's been given an opportunity over the course of his career. Now he is playing in that Kyle Shanahan scheme in San Francisco. Now he comes over to Kevin O'Connell, who does use some of the same run concepts. So I think it will be interesting to see how they divide that workload up between him and Aaron Jones. Obviously, Aaron Jones getting a little bit older, Ian, also a guy that has battled some injuries through the course of his career. So I think you peg it right now as Aaron Jones obviously is the lead back. He got his $20 million contract. But like you mentioned, Jordan Mason, 2 years, $12 million, $7 million guaranteed. He's the clear running back 2 now for the Vikings. But it could be something where we see it more of a 50-50, between these two guys. Typically, there's a third back. It's never really 50-50, but you know what I mean? Those two guys could be a lot closer than we think. I do think this moves Jordan Mason, whereas before we didn't know. Like if something happened to Christian McCaffrey, you've also got Isaac Gendo, who we probably need to talk about in a second as well. But they kind of pushed both of the players down the board, right? Because we didn't have neither were a clear handcuff if their lead running back went down. Well, now, as of today, we have a very deep draft class, so we have to acknowledge that. Both of these teams could draft a running back. One of them could. Neither of them could. We don't know for sure, but there's going to be plenty of talent. But as of today, yeah, man. I mean, Jordan Mason, I feel the most confident in that he's the running back 2. Isaac Gendo, like if he can avoid another, running back landing there during the draft, he also gets a big bump up. But I don't know where you move Mason in yours, Ian, but I moved him up into that range where we know we've got the really clear running back 2s on their team. They play in good offenses. We get upside if the starter goes down, but could have a little standalone value just depending on how things play out this year.
You guys can check out Dwayne and my own fantasy rankings over at fantasylife.com because we are sick enough in the head to already have these bad boys ready to go and updated again throughout free agency. So I think you hit the nail on the head, Dwayne. Aaron Jones sitting pretty as my RB24, your RB23. So he certainly is still getting, the benefit of the doubt in the ranks. But once you start moving more so into that, borderline RB3 area, you see guys like Tank Bigsby, DeAndre Swift, Rico Dowdle, Tajay Spears. Again, running backs who we know have the capability of potentially running away and picking up some big production if given the opportunity. But as things stand right now, certainly looking like more so RB2s. But do you think, honestly, Dwayne, that Mason could be good enough to go ahead and, I don't want to say completely yank the starting job away from Aaron Jones, but man, I mean, I was talking about some of the efficiency stats before. He was third, actually, out of all these running backs last year in next-gen stats, rushing yards over expected per carry, and just even raw counting numbers. I mean, only Derrick Henry and Saquon actually have more rushing yards than Mason during the first 8 weeks of 2024. So, I do respect Aaron Jones. I still think he is very much good at football, but, we did see Bucky Irving manage to displace Rachaad White down the stretch of 2024. Do you think Mason perhaps could have that in his potential range of outcomes in 2025?
I mean, it's possible. I think Aaron Jones, even at his age, is a lot better than Rachaad White, right?
Yeah.
Just still a player that looks more explosive. Even though he isn't what he once was, it's still more than what you're getting with a guy like Rachaad White. But like I was saying a minute ago, like it wouldn't surprise me if suddenly we saw Jordan Mason take over more of the early down work. We saw that with Aaron Jones elsewhere in his career and years with AJ Dillon, and there's been other guys that he shared that backfield with going back. So, I mean, I could see the Vikings wanting to, maybe just keep Aaron Jones a little bit more fresh. You could see something where maybe it's 55% of the early down work goes to Jordan Mason, but Aaron Jones picks up the pass down work and like another 40% of the workload. The other thing with Aaron Jones getting older, that could be another thing to just kind of help protect him throughout the year. So I think it's hard to pin down exactly what they'll do, but they did invest enough in Jordan Mason as far as the contract to know that he's going to have a role. It's not just going to be Aaron Jones with this guy sitting on the bench and you have to have an injury. I do think there's an opportunity where Aaron Jones could actually lead, or Jordan Mason could lead the team in rushing attempts.
Obviously, last season didn't end great for Jordan Mason. He had the midseason AC joint sprain, and then unfortunately suffered a high ankle sprain in December. But while he was sidelined, Dwayne, we really did get to see, again, kind of the secondary star of this deal, as you hinted at before. Isaac Guerendo get more of a chance to lead this backfield, obviously with Christian McCaffrey still sidelined at that point as well. So with Guerendo, just one of these guys where, no, doesn't have the highest draft capital. He was just the 129th overall pick in the fourth round of last year's draft. But Dwayne, I know you've been in the weeds all month long, kind of looking at your rookie RB supermodel and some of these speed scores. And at the end of the day, Isaac Guerendo, God only made so many humans that weigh 220 plus pounds and have his sort of speed. So all of a sudden, really enticing because, again, CMC, as we've seen over the years, if he is going to miss a little time, whoever his handcuff is going to be, winds up being a bit of a golden child in fantasy land. And right now, Guerendo certainly seems to be that next man up.
Yeah, really small sample. Isaac Guerendo looked good in his limited opportunities, but then he got hurt. So that's the challenge here. We're talking about a rushing sample of 84 carries. So you guys can kind of take this with a grain of salt. You know that this stuff can be, it's typically, the things I'm about to name are typically sticky to the running back, meaning like it is repetitive year over year. The running backs usually own these stats, but again, we're dealing with a small sample here on Guerendo. If you look at his explosive rush rate, Ian, which those are carries of 10 plus yards or more, which is a calling card for this 49ers offense. They usually like to have somebody that can hit these home runs. Guerendo was good in that statistic. He had 11% of his carries go for 10 plus yards. The NFL average is 9%. So he was above that. Rushing, as far as his missed tackles forced per attempt, 17%, right in line with the league average, but slightly over in yards after contact at 3.0. The NFL over the last 5 years is 10.9. So Guerendo, and just watching him, and you can go, the one play I know some people got mad in because if I remember correctly, he did like go down inside the 5.
He did it multiple times, man. Like just go scoring touchdowns.
Yeah, I knew he was on the sheesh report. So, brain's a little foggy. Have to go dust that off. But I knew there was at least one time. So there was a long touchdown that he could have had there. So I think he does have that long speed. It will be interesting to see what the 49ers do in the draft. Kyle Shanahan's tempted to draft running backs every single year. I think he's going to be super tempted to draft a running back early in this draft, given how deep the class is.
And the cool thing I think we got with Guerendo, again, good efficiency even in a small sample size, but in that week 15 game, even though he did get injured at the end, 76% snap rate, Dwayne. I mean, it's really tough to find head coaches that are still willing in the year 2025 to give whoever their running back is that sort of true workhorse role. But certainly 49ers believe Guerendo is a complete enough 3-down talent to go ahead and warrant that sort of usage. So top 15 marks in terms of yards per catch and even yards per route run last season. Guerendo really does have that explosive pass catching ability we look for in our handcuffs. Accordingly, going to be someone that, again, if you had that late round dart to throw, could certainly, give you some nice upside. God forbid those injury gods continue to not be so nice to Christian McCaffrey. So again, had that bit of Saturday news come along, but also
where'd you move Guerendo in your ranks? I moved him to 150. I kept him below the guys that I feel better about their teams not drafting a running back, even though we never know. But Guerendo was one that I was like, man, I really feel like the 49ers could draft a guy, and that's going to change our opinion. But I got him in the range, basically, where you could see the other names, like Jalen Wright, some of these, even like a Marshawn Lloyd. He's in that range with those guys, but a little bit lower.
Ray Davis, I think, is in there as well. Tyler Algier, Blake Corum.
Yeah.
I just feel a little better about pretty much all those guys we just named, with the exception of Marshawn Lloyd, definitely being the second man up. Again, we'll see what happens after the draft. Maybe I have to eat that statement because the Bills, are the team that actually uses a day 2 pick on the position. But again, I think really the moral of the story with that entire group, Dwain, is they're only one injury away from rocketing up those ranks. So Isaac Guerrero, certainly going to be in that low end RB4 discussion. Just really doesn't have a prayer of getting any standalone value. That would just be my deal breaker. I do think guys like Ray Davis and Jalen Wright, bit better chance of potentially, again, having a couple games where they're able to eat into the starter's workload. I don't see Garendo, again, taking CMC off the field if the 49ers can help it.
Yeah, we're on the same page. But CMC's getting up there age, so lots of outs for him.
Lots of outs indeed. Speaking of players getting up there in age, Cooper Kupp has went ahead and signed with the Seattle Seahawks. 3 years, $45 million deal. The $15 million per year annually puts him ahead of guys like Cortland Sutton, Khalil Shakur, and Darnell Mooney. However, not making that big boy money like Christian Kirk, Jerry Jeudy, Mike Evans, amongst others. So look, Dwain, in the just spirit of small sample sizes that we can try to draw conclusions from, last year in weeks 8 to 14 last season, Cooper Kupp was the PPR wide receiver 4 overall. So it's not like, we have to go back years or anything to find the last time he was effective. That said, down the stretch really was rough, man. Like anyone that's had the, opposite of a privilege to start him in the fantasy playoffs saw just how dire things were down the stretch. And to have an organization like the Rams, who I think we all generally agree are one of the smartest groups, at the forefront of really using analytics and things like that, to see the Rams just have no interest in bringing Kupp back really is concerning looking ahead to 2025 and beyond. That said, Kupp has unfortunately, which again, a reality, unfortunately, with some of these older players, been suffering a lot of injuries, in the early parts of the year that maybe zapped against some of that explosiveness and some of that ability that we saw from the Triple Crown winner. So, Dwain, again, I don't want to completely rule out Cooper Kupp still having some juice left, but hasn't been great in recent years.
Now, I think what this tells me is pretty clear, and it's the fact, well, number one, you're going to let Cooper Kupp go. And it's not just because he's old. He's going to be 32, but then you bring in Davante Adams. So you're willing to bring in an older wide receiver. So they clearly think Davante Adams can play, and Cooper Kupp can't. And we know that Sean McVay is one of these coaches that can truly get the extra juice out of a wide receiver. Most coaches can't. But Sean McVay is one of the very few that can turn a guy that might normally be a 20% target share guy into 30%. And what this signaled to us is all those things they used to design for Cooper Kupp, they're giving them to Puka Nacua.
Yeah.
So when you think about that, and that McVay was giving him a big edge, it's not to say Cooper Kupp wasn't good, but he's getting a big part of his edge from getting to play with Sean McVay. Is he still going to get that edge going to play with Clint Kubiak, who traditionally has used 2 wide receiver sets? He could easily decide that he wants to use 3 now. You do have Sam Darnold in town. Sam Darnold, I would say, at least he's not Matthew Stafford, but he's willing to push the ball down the field like Matthew Stafford. He's got similar ball placement to Matthew Stafford. So I think he's going to be willing to try to fit the ball in to get it, to a player like Cooper Kupp. But then you got Jackson Smith and Jigba, Ian, and really his best place to play is in the inside as well. So now you have 2 of these guys with overlapping skill sets. Who's going to have to play on the outside? Maybe both of them on most snaps if you run Clint Kubiak's traditional offense, which is 2 wide receivers. And who's going to stretch the vertical boundary here? These are both players that are going to have an ADOT between 8 and 10. They attack the same parts of the field. So look, I'm not saying Cooper Kupp can't still be good, but I think a lot of the things that he was getting that were kind of, easy gimmies that he was getting in that offense before with the Rams that they are now giving to Puka Nacua, he's not a lock to get those here in Seattle. And in fact, he could find himself having to play an even lesser role because they want to give the things they do like that. They may want to give to JSN. So it's a weird fit to me, Cooper Kupp in Seattle.
It just looks like, honestly, a poor man's version of the very same Rams offense that Kupp just left. We have MVS as your kind of, sacrificial X, just going to be running a lot of wind sprints out there. Tutu Atwell's the younger, probably more explosive version at this point. And look, I'm not trying to take anything away from Jackson Smith and Jigba, but I think we can agree that, again, Puka Nacua at this point in time is a superior talent, going to be putting up better numbers. We just discussed Kupp versus Adams. I am in agreement with the Rams that, Adams is a better player right now. And then Darnold versus Matthew Stafford. Again, man, give me Stafford, and certainly give me that Rams offensive line over what the Seahawks have been dealing with. So, hey, not saying that Kubiak can't maybe get the most out of Darnold and JSN, but yeah, man, like if we had to go around before this signing and try to pick, the top 5 to 10 offenses that we wanted to see Kupp in, I'm not so sure the Seahawks exactly would have been making it. No. So does this concern you though overall, Dwain, with JSN? Because he's someone, before this news that a lot of people were thinking could be a dark horse to lead the entire NFL in targets, and in some of these way too early drafts going on, consensus seemingly top 12 wide receivers. So moving him down with the newfound presence of Kupp?
I think I've got him at wide receiver 14, right around there. So I'm not gonna be too worried about it. And it goes back to like Cooper Kupp was fading last year. They gave all the easy stuff away to Puka Nacua. They signed another older wide receiver in Davante Adams. So I'm gonna lean into the signal that the Rams know what they're doing. Now, I will say Cooper Kupp got a nice contract. It's not like he had to sit there and wait on the street. So another NFL team did look at him and evaluate him as being someone that could add value to their team. And as much as we may sit here and, want to nitpick like the roles and how they ultimately make all of that work out, the good news for Kupp is he only has to compete with JSN. So that's a positive. But to your point, now JSN, if they are right on Cooper Kupp, he does have to compete with him. But at the end of the day, I didn't move JSN down that far, Ian, because he's still the younger player. He broke out last year. Those are typically things we really want to pay attention to. So I just moved JSN down a couple of spots in my ranks, but it wasn't very big.
Last year we did see a lot of these quote unquote elderly running backs, really come back and have these awesome seasons with their new team. So maybe Cooper Kupp can start that sort of movement for wide receivers. But yeah, certainly not going to be someone I'm going out of my way to draft here in 2025 and most likely beyond. Boys are buzzing, breaking down the fantasy implications of all the NFL news that we've had again going down over the course of these last 2 weeks. So I know we like to say the NBA offseason is the best, and I'll give it a little credit. It is a lot of fun, but man, Dwayne, especially with some of this quarterback movement in recent years, NFL is even trying to take over that crown, and I wouldn't put it past them. But obviously, crown jewel of this QB free agency class was one Mr. Sam Darnold, and he has found a new home with the Seattle Seahawks. 3 years with over $100 million, so $55 million of that being guaranteed. So, briefly just talked about the Seahawks offense with JSN and everything, and really, Dwayne, I don't think we can overstate enough how much of a potential downgrade, Darnold is facing, leaving the friendly confines of Minnesota, now for the Seattle Seahawks unit.
Yeah, I mean, you lose Justin Jefferson. That obviously hurts. We're talking about one of the top 2 wide receivers in the NFL. Like that's the argument, right? Justin Jefferson versus Jamar Chase, pretty much. So that's and it's nothing. It's not a knock against JSN, right? It's not a knock even against Cooper Kupp, but it's Justin Jefferson, man. There's just not many of those. We get a receiver like that, or 1 or 2 of those every 10 years, and he happens to be one. So losing that definitely hurts. But when you look at Darnold, the big thing I have, a question on, Ian, is just like, really where he's been good, like for his career. Now he's forced turnovers and things, but he's willing to push the ball down the field. He wants to push the ball down the field. He's willing to make these tight window throws. So from that aspect, I can see that working out okay for a guy like JSN, because Geno also threw a lot of tight window throws to JSN, even though he wasn't necessarily open, especially on deeper throws. So I think that could be a positive. But when you think about what Darnold does the best, and then you think about these wide receivers that he's working with here, it's not necessarily like an exact match made in heaven. I mean, you just don't. I don't know that JSN or Cooper Kupp have what it's going to take to really like unlock things down the field. We have not seen that from them in recent years. That's also not what JSN was known for in college. Now Yes, he can come up with the big play, guys. I'm not saying Jason can't make plays down the field, but to this point, college career, NFL career has not been a guy that really has that deep average depth of target. So it's going to be more of a east-west kind of offense, not north and south, sideline to sideline. So I think that's going to be interesting for Darnold because he's historically known for wanting to push it down the field. And I'm sorry, MVS is just not going to be a big enough reason to want to do that.
I mean, honestly, I would be very excited about the potential, DK Metcalf Darnold partnership, but obviously that's not going to be a reality. So yeah, we are forced to maybe, have JSN be in that square peg you're trying to get into a round hole. So I know there was all this chatter, Dwayne, especially after JSN's rookie season, like, oh, look how low his ADOT is. They should use him downfield more. And yes, that was true, but it was only true relative to that just diminutive ADOT he had. Like, all right, let's not treat the guy like Rondale Moore, out here basically. So They were just using him as such a pure gadget, it was like, okay, let's, consider throwing the ball over to intermediate areas. JSN obviously not a guy with the speed, or I would even say, deep ball ability to truly be putting fear in more defenses than not, particularly now with guys like Metcalf and even Tyler Lockett gone. So all due respect to MVS, Clint Kubiak obviously with the Saints was able to get a lot out of him, but come on, I think we've seen enough from Marquez Valdes-Scantling at this point to not have overly high expectations. So I guess, Dwayne, my biggest issue here is just, again, the Seahawks reigning 31st ranked offensive line, because Darnold, you said it, man, when he knows where to go with the football, he's got an open receiver, he can spin it, up there with pretty much anyone. But going along with that, Vikings last year did have the third longest average time to throw. I'm just worried that, again, behind that Seahawks O-line, we're going to see Darnold's processing sped up. And let's face it, we've seen that, more years than not from Darnold in his career. And it was a big reason why, again, up until last year, widely viewed, as one of the bigger busts from that class.
Yeah, no offensive line in football gave up more pressures in the regular season last year than what we saw from the Seahawks. So that could be a problem for Darnold. We saw Darnold, for the most part, had good protection last year, but when it broke down, Ian, we saw the old Sam Darnold, especially in the red zone, just throwing balls up for grabs, turning things that could be touchdown or at least a field goal drive into turnovers in the red zone. And that's just tough stuff, like especially when we talk about the coaching staff and the way that they feel about sorts of things like that. So when I look at Darnold, I do agree with you that the big risk here is with the offensive line and what the Seahawks decide to do there. They've obviously got they can't, I don't think they can just stand pat. We'll see what they do in the draft. I know they've got the 18th pick in the first round, but they also could feel like they need speed at wide receiver. Now, they could think about doing something more in the early second round with some guys that be going in that range as far as the wide receivers go. But yeah, Darnold needs some help. The biggest risk here is you have a meltdown where he looks more like what we saw with the Jets versus what we saw last year with the Vikings.
Seahawks with picks 18, 50, 52, 82, and 92 in terms of looking at, again, spots inside the top three rounds. 18, Dwayne, probably a little bit too late to get, Ted McMillan, who seems to widely be viewed as number one wide receiver in this class. Is there someone, though, maybe a Matthew Golden type, though, that you do think could fit into this offense? Because, again, if you are looking for that deep field stretching speed, why not take the guy that can run that, 4.2, 940?
Yeah, Golden would be the one, and that's probably high for him. The Seahawks could think about trading back, but we'll see. I mean, it only takes one team to want to go after the speed if they think that's what's going to unlock the offense. But Golden's a really interesting prospect because he didn't necessarily ever truly break out in college as far as like big production goes. But whenever I put him through the rookie supermodel, folks can check that out over at fantasylife.com. He actually graded really highly, though, when he was targeted. And so he comped out favorably to guys like, Terry McLaurin over the years, even George Pickens. And not saying that he's stylistically exactly like these players. These are guys they played in college at bigger programs. There was more target competition going around. They played highly competitive schedules, and they didn't necessarily blow it up in college. But when they had their opportunities, they were really good. And so when you see guys like that get first-round draft capital, meaning an NFL team is essentially saying, hey, we think we can get a lot more out of them than what you saw production-wise at the next level, and that's what first-round draft capital signals. That would be huge for Matthew Golden, and he would be the guy, to your point, Ian, in that range that if you wanted to pull the trigger on it, he would be very different than the other two players that you're going to be putting on the field. Ted McMillan, honestly, would be a lot more like what you already have. He's going to be more of a possession guy. We really like him. He's going to be good in fantasy football. He grades out as the highest wide receiver in the rookie supermodel. But if you're looking for someone that can truly unlock that next level and potentially take your offense to a spot where Darnold can do, the things that really make him great and make defenses respect every inch of the field, I do think that Matthew Golden would be the name.
Speaking of offenses that could be in that day two wide receiver market here come late April, we do have Justin Fields joining the Jets. Jets. 2 years, $40 million with $30 million guaranteed. Basically now becomes the cheapest starting quarterback in the league. But hey, nothing wrong with racking in $40 million over the course of 2 calendar years. Still have Tyrod Taylor behind him, but Dwayne, it does seem like Justin Fields will have his longest leash in years in terms of being able to be the starting quarterback in New York. Now, again, we've seen him try to to be more of a pure passer over the years. And honestly, similar to Darnold, you do see flashes when he knows where to go with the football. I mean, he has a big arm, but man, if the guy could just play quarterback, on 1.5 speed, like we can program on podcasts, I do think it would be, certainly a better situation for him. That said, Dwain, even if we're looking at this Jets offense, we have concerns on the O-line. We have very little firepower outside of Garrett Wilson and the passing game. That all might not really matter for Fields because, as we've seen over the years, quarterbacks who do run as much as him, really, really hard to bust in fantasy land.
Yeah, even if they're bad as passers. So going back to 2011, we've seen 23 quarterbacks reach 120 rushing attempts and throw for under 3,500 yards. Justin Fields is already on that list twice. And so those quarterbacks average 20.1 fantasy points per game with an average finish of QB 11. So even if you really stink, in the passing department, if you get that type of rushing volume, you're more than likely going to be a top 12 fantasy quarterback. And then let's just think the other outs that the guy has. One, he does improve as a passer. Like, he did have a career high 65% completion rate last season, Ian. So he did make some strides there. So he could just improve. The other thing could be you could just get lucky and have a good passing season. We see this all the time, these guys that suddenly have this high efficiency passing season. And if you get that on top of the very sturdy baseline of what he can do as a rusher, and that's one of the key things. Like right now we're at Fantasy Life, we're working on the new tools for the offseason. And one of the things we're going through is ceiling and floor projection models. And one of the things that we've noticed is, like, for quarterbacks, like when you look at their rushing yards, like it's really steady, like compared to other things that we're measuring for quarterbacks, because the way we want the calculations to work is based on each stat that we're giving to the quarterback. There's larger or less variance around those stats. And quarterbacks, as far as the ones that can do things like Fields does on the ground, it's really something that's pretty sticky week to week. So knowing that you've got that kind of floor, if you will, set with Justin Fields, and then if he does come alive as a passer, either due to luck or improvement, that's absolutely huge for him. I think you could argue that, honestly, Justin Fields, he's the guy that improved his fantasy standing the most in all of free agency. I know we'll talk about Najee, but it was almost more status quo, right? He probably got a little bit of an upgrade versus where he was with the Steelers. But if you just look at went from don't even know if you're drafting a guy to now in the top 100 picks in a fantasy draft, it's Justin Fields.
Way too early rankings. I have Justin Fields QB 12, and Dwain is one spot ahead of me as the QB 11. So again, we have seen situations where you have an Anthony Richardson where they just can't even hold on to the job. They're a bad enough passer where, believe it or not, everyone, you cannot score fantasy points if you're not on the field. But again, given the contract, given the lack of competition behind him, certainly seems like Fields will have every chance to hopefully get back to winning us some fantasy championships. So good stuff there with Fields. Obviously, though, Dwain, one of the quick reactions of this news was, oh my gosh, this is going to be horrible for Garrett Wilson. And I do wonder if people are just, being a little bit too quick to, think that, because DJ Moore back in 2023 with Justin Fields finished as the PPR wide receiver 6. And I understand 2024 didn't go as great with George Pickens during the first 6 weeks of the year, but just simply writing off Fields as, oh, look, this is a guy who the Bears didn't want anymore, and then he got benched after 6 games in Pittsburgh. I mean, he had 10 touchdowns to just 1 interception when you include the rushing scores in Pittsburgh. Obviously, they had already promised Russell Wilson the chance to have the job when he was healthy. And then the Bears moved on because, Caleb Williams is under center. But it just cracks me up, Dwain, kind of looking at Fields being the main problem in Chicago. And then last year happens, and it's like, oh, no, it was the offensive line, the play calling. Like, maybe those 2 factors also had something to do with Fields' struggles as well. So overall thoughts on, again, what Fields can be more so as a passer, specifically in terms of what Garrett Wilson can do.
Well, I think we need to get lucky. We just talked about Fields. He could still improve. Like, he's a young player. But at the same time, I mean, the last 4 years, passing yards per game, 158, 197, the year with DJ Moore, 149, 156. So we could also just as easily argue the 197 was just his outlier year where he got lucky and things went well for him. And he was still below 200 yards per game as a passer. It was enough, to your point, to unlike DJ Moore. But DJ Moore also ran really pure that year, if you go back and look at his data points. So I think you have to be concerned about Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson's still a young, talented player, Ian. He's a guy that we like to kind of compare to Deontay Johnson. Always going to earn targets, gets open in a phone booth, can beat you over the top. He can actually beat you over the top better than Deontay Johnson, but they just never fully put it together, right? Deontay Johnson did have that wide receiver 8 season, but then outside of that, it never really truly worked out. Garrett Wilson kind of starting to fall into that same, mold, and they're very similar players from an archetype standpoint. So I don't want to take anything away from Justin Fields, from Garrett Wilson really being a good player. But I do think that DJ Moore is kind of like an outlier ceiling case for Garrett Wilson. I think we're looking at a median range, as for the average range where we would be thinking about Garrett Wilson, Ian. I would think more mid-range wide receiver 2 to low-end wide receiver 2. And then maybe if you get the outlier season, you do get the wide receiver 1 campaign.
Certainly, as a longtime Columbus, Ohio lifer, I am pulling for Garrett Wilson more than others. But man, Dwayne, even if he hasn't exactly had this sky-high top 5 season just yet, still an awfully great company in terms of what he's managed to accomplish through 3 NFL seasons. In fact, only 10 players have actually managed to gain 1,000-plus receiving yards in each of their first 3 seasons in the Super Bowl era. Yes, Garrett Wilson is one of them. And the other players, Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle, Justin Jefferson, Michael Thomas, OBJ, Mike Evans, AJ Green, Randy Moss, and shout out to Mr. John Jefferson as well. So a lot of LSU Tigers on there. Obviously, wide receiver you earn, but yes, still do think we can see bigger things ahead from Mr. Garrett Wilson. Hopefully, Justin Fields is the man to get him there. So
where'd you put Garrett in the ranks after this?
Still,
I did move him down a little bit. I'm gonna be honest, because I do think it's just tougher to get to the ceiling outcome, and we care a lot about the ceiling. So I did move him down, but I'm curious as to if you moved him at all.
I have him wide receiver 15 right next to Terry McLaurin, Mike Evans, Zay Flowers. If you wanted to just say, hey, Terry's got Jaden Daniels, Evans has Baker Mayfield, and move him a few spots down, I wouldn't call you crazy.
Yeah, I'm 19, so I'm closer to the low end. I'm at 18. Waz is 19, and then Freeman's at 14. So Waz and I are closer to leaning towards like low end wide receiver, mid range to low end wide receiver 2 territory, and you and Freeman are still leaning towards high end wide receiver 2.
As we continue to chug along against some of the biggest storylines that have emerged from free agency, we have now gotten 2 running backs, and really, Dwayne, wasn't a bigger, signing than Najee Harris taking his talents out west to Los Angeles, teaming up with the Chargers on a 1-year deal worth up to $9.25 million, base is just a little bit over $5 million. So Gus Edwards still a free agent. Seemingly they're done with J.K. Dobbins. He's also still out there, and this leaves Najee in a running back room that only consists of Hassan Haskins and Kamani Vidal. So unlike, Cooper Kupp, who we were talking about last segment, saying like, man, Seahawks really not one of these spots that we probably would have preferred. Honestly, if you kind of took what we were thinking a couple of weeks ago and said where would be the number 1 place for Najee Harris to go to maximize his 2025 fantasy value, might have gone with the Chargers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you come to a team that we know wants to establish the run, a team that loves to have that running back that can bring that physicality to the game. Najee Harris does that. Now, I think we all agree, Ian, like Najee's not like this hyper explosive player, but it probably has gotten to the point where people are even too hard on Najee. Like if you look at what he did last year, it's funny how these narratives go, right? I remember early on in his career, everybody loved Najee. I was like, he's mid, and then now it's like, oh my God, Najee Harris is terrible. And it's like, no, actually, he's like mid. So, I mean, he's still kind of in the same range. I mean, last year was his career high, though, as far as explosive rush rate. 11% of his carries went for 10-plus yards. It's really been around 9% before that. He had a 24% missed tackles forced per attempt rate. That is a career high for him as well. Yards after contact, right at the league average of 2.9, but it was at 3.1 the year before. So, I think the big thing, though, when you look at Najee, he's a big back, Ian, that you can load up with a big workload. And I do think coaches care about that. And if Najee Harris gets to come to the Chargers, and the key thing here is if he gets to keep that passing down work. Remember, that was his rookie season. That was a huge part of why Najee Harris was so good as a rookie in fantasy football. He got to stay on the field on passing downs. And looking at this, depth chart that you just talked about, it's not going to be Hassan Haskins out there on passing downs. They tried to give some of that role to Kamani Vidal last year. He didn't ever really take it, couldn't run with it. He'll be in his second year. But look, it's not like Kamani Vidal is this high, draft pick that they've got a lot invested in. I could easily see this team just saying, nah, we're just going to keep Najee out there. We trust him to pick up the blitz. He could pick up some check downs, especially if they don't bring anybody else in. They did add Mike Williams, but really your whole passing offense is centered around McConkey. That is the sort of situation that can add up for a back. Like, it's not, Najee is not Alvin Kamara. Najee's not Christian McCaffrey. He's not this guy you can work at the second level and be a mismatch. But if it's kind of a one read and I'm getting to my check down, Najee is capable of being that back. And so this could be a situation where we see Najee get back to being closer to where we saw him as a rookie, Ian, as far as the targets. And if that happens, If that happens, Najee Harris is going to be a top 12 running back. Obviously, again, every time we talk about a running back, caveat, 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 it's a deep draft class. The Chargers could still easily add competition for Najee Harris. But as of right now, man, I moved him up to running back 18 in the ranks. And I've got a piece coming out tomorrow on fantasylife.com. You guys can all check it out, talking about early movers up and down with rankings as far as what's happened in free agency. And I also do give you a little bit of rookie talk since I've been in the rookie bunker here for the last month. But I think Najee Harris, man, mid-range running back 2 for me right now, Ian. How about you?
I got him up there, same spot, RB19 for me, because again, you mentioned the rookie year success, 94 targets, caught 74 of those. And I just don't think there's been enough put behind the fact that it's not like the Steelers offense has been a good environment for any running back to thrive in. Okay. I mean, kudos to Jalen Warren. He's put up awesome numbers, better than Najee. I get it. But hey, stack up Jalen's, tackles avoided per carry, his yards after contact against any running back in the NFL. And you're still going to see him, ranking near the top of the leaderboard. So with Najee, again, the Steelers over these past 4 years, 29th in terms of their team rank in yards before contact per rush. I don't think it's been a high scoring environment with, the corpse of Big Ben, under center in 2021, and then Kenny Pickett and washed versions of Russell Wilson in 2024. I just feel like, again, he was a first round running back in the day. People had to draft him really high in fantasy drafts. And when you aren't putting up, 2,000 yards and 20 touchdowns, you're going to be considered a disappointment, even if relative to a normal running back, you are probably just fine. So just, again, Dwayne, I'm not saying Najee is Jahmyr Gibbs or even should be in the discussion as a top 5 or even top 10 running back. But I think that similar sentiment is true for guys like Kyren Williams, like Joe Mixon. And guess what? When you give them a lot of volume and a good offense, you get a ton of fantasy points. Certainly seems like that's the path Najee's heading down as well.
And let me ask you this real quick. If they don't take a running back on day 2, how are you feeling about Najee? Are you still hedging it? RB18, I'm still hedging a little bit.
Yeah.
Like I can see him moving up a little bit more if they don't take someone. Because right now it's wide open, but he could take a hit in the draft. But if that doesn't happen, are you going to move Najee up more?
I think he goes right into the top 12. Again, right next to Kyren Williams and Joe Mixon. All these guys had basically bad efficiency numbers. You can talk about Kyren having better vision and this and that. But again, you're just not seeing running backs who have that, one hitter quitter home run ability. But hey, it's really hard to bust Dwayne if you're getting 20 plus touches and a halfway decent offense. And that certainly is what the Chargers profile as in 2025. So good stuff for Najee. Maybe not as good stuff for Javonte Williams and Miles Sanders. On the one hand, they actually maybe have a chance at some relevancy in 2025 after the Cowboys gave them both 1-year deals. But man, Dwayne, I mean, we're sitting here, a couple of Cowboys fans, and I would really like to think that adding Javonte and Miles isn't going to dissuade Jerry Jones and company from using one of those early round picks on the position. If anything, I would say they're more likely to do so after, again, adding these guys. But then again, trying to parse through what exactly the Jones family is trying to do in recent years hasn't been easy. So as things stand right now, Dwayne, it is March 16th. What do you think the chances are of the Cowboys actually leaving the draft without having used a pick inside the top 100 on the position?
It feels low. But again, like the Cowboys do this thing where they'll trade down and they'll think we're not going to take the running back here because they think they can still get it, and they misread the market. They misread things the way things are supposed to unfold in the draft, and then they're left without the player, right, that they wanted. They miss out on an entire tier. So like there are scenarios where that happens to them a couple times in the first 2 days of the draft, and they don't walk away with a running back. So it'll be interesting. To your point, these are not big deals that they've given to Javonte Williams or Miles Sanders. I did move Javonte up the ranks with this news because there is a run out where they don't take somebody. And if that's the case, probably looking at more of a split between him and Sanders. I know we're not that excited. Javonte, Ian, I don't know where you stand, but like for me, looking at him, we've had 2 years now, right, since the really bad knee injury. One of the worst knee injuries that we've seen in like the last 5 years for a running back to suffer. So you obviously, you feel for Javonte. Man, like if you look at where he was in 2021 and 2022, explosive rush rate, across those years, 12 and 15%. The last 2 years, 10 and 9%. So basically at the league average. Missed tackles forced per attempt, 31% and 34%, down to 16 and 15. Look at that yards after contact, man, 3.4 and 3.5. Javonte was a beast in those 2 years. In the last 2 years, 2.7 and 2.4, well below the league average of 2.9. So you kind of got to wonder, like, okay, maybe 2 years removed. He's still a young player. You know what I mean? We're talking about a guy that, going into the season is only going to be 25 in Javonte Williams. So is he really more what we've seen for the last 2 years, or was the knee injury just so bad that we could get lucky and see a bounce back, even if it was in the middle, right, of what we've seen in the last 2 years and what we saw from those first 2 years of his career? Like, Javonte could end up being an absolute deal. It's hard for me to get super confident in that. I feel like right now you kind of got to lean into him being the back we've seen the last 2 years.
I do wonder how much of this was legit Javonte having such a good game against the Cowboys back in 2021, because we see this phenomenon throughout free agency, man. He had 111 yards with some truly awesome yak in that, Broncos upset over the Cowboys a few years ago. We saw Jordan Mason have a really good game in week 2 against the Vikings. Kenneth Gainwell was ripping off some big plays when he got a chance to go up against the Steelers. Like, look, I know these NFL teams are tapped into the rest of the league as well, but really do think sometimes that memory of watching players inside, their stadium actually put up some numbers ends up carrying a bit more weight than maybe it should. But hopefully, again, the injury gods can at least let Javonte have a chance for a nice comeback season. I know the Cowboys fans would appreciate that. What's going on, everyone? Hope your Sunday has been fabulous. It's your boy Ian Hartitz and Dwain McFarland breaking down, some of the cool fantasy news that's happened over the course of the last week or so. But Dwain, I don't think there was a bigger singular move than the Seahawks deciding to ship DK Metcalf to the Pittsburgh Steelers. It came out that Metcalf was hoping for, a warm weather location and didn't exactly get that in Pittsburgh, but he did get a fancy 5-year, $150 million contract extension. Those annual earnings now places him behind only Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, A.J. Brown, and our one true sun god, Amon-Ra St. Brown. So Seahawks got a 2025 second-round pick in return. Clearly, they were not, looking to extend Metcalf, but he now has his money in Pittsburgh. The question is who exactly he is going to be catching passes from. Him and George Pickens, again, forming one of the better wide receiver duos, I think you could say, in the NFL, at least in the top 10. But honestly, man, that thing stand. Could be Aaron Rodgers, could be Russell Wilson. If it's not those guys, Mason Rudolph, like there's we were just talking in the break, Dwayne, about floor and ceiling outcomes for certain guys. I mean, Metcalf has a pretty wide one right now.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it. The quarterback's going to be huge. Like if you get, Russ Wilson back, if you get Aaron Rodgers, I would feel a little better about Aaron Rodgers having a chance of supporting 2 guys, Ian, versus Russ. I think Russ can support one of these players. But, it's pretty close, like between the two. But we're not going to be super excited, right? We're hoping that they can just at least get one of those guys. If they don't, and we're dealing with a scenario outside of that, like a Mason Rudolph, dear God, like that is going to be a terrible situation. We've already got to worry about Arthur Smith, who rotates his best players off the field more than any other coordinator in the NFL. So that's going to be hitting Metcalf. It's been hitting all the guys that Arthur Smith has ever handled, over his history. So that's something that's probably going to continue. We've got an offense that we know wants to run the ball, like they're going to want to be balanced. So I think there's a lot potentially working against Metcalf here. He's a good player. Is Metcalf a top 12 wide receiver in the NFL? I don't think so. Is he going to make pretty much any team he lands on better? I do think that. I think that this is something that's positive for the Pittsburgh Steelers, but Metcalf has never really shown us, Ian, that ability to win at all levels of the field at all times. He can win at any level. He's just not consistent in the way that he does that. And that's impacted his ability to really turn into like a true alpha target earner. He's never really been that and never made that next step in his career. He's obviously a big dude, can hit you with a touchdown from anywhere, but can he work consistently at all the levels? And I think at this point we have to say no. And he's very similar to George Pickens. So, this isn't the same scenario where we talked about JSN and Cooper Kupp being, the same, because it's like the opposite of it, right? JSN and Cooper Kupp, we talk about, hey, they're really like 9 to 10 average depth of target guys. You start looking at Metcalf and you look at George Pickens, it's the opposite. Like these guys are both going to stretch the field out. They win the 50-50 balls, those sort of things. Actually, what Metcalf is interesting, he's never really been a great 50-50 ball guy, but he can beat you over the top, right? So Pickens better in that regard, but it's a lot, man, to think you're going to support both of these. So I'm hedging right now. I've got Metcalf as wide receiver 28 in my ranks. He's my number 58 player overall. George Pickens falls down to wide receiver 38, so he's not even in the top 36 anymore. George Pickens is a top 36 talent in the NFL at wide receiver, but too many questions for me. Quarterback, and you got to deal with a coordinator with Arthur Smith and competition from another good teammate. That's going to be really hard, Ian. These guys are going to be a bit all over the place.
Seemed like Metcalf was on the verge of taking that step into the position's top 12. He actually did finish as a wide receiver 10 during his second season back in 2020. However, in 4 years since, he has been between the wide receiver 22 and wide receiver 31. Yeah, just more or less being a boomer bust wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 type in fantasy land, and never quite, putting up the sort of numbers that you'd expect from someone who, again, is as big and fast as Metcalf. But I thought it was a good point, too, as much as people want to say that they have these same skill sets. Metcalf, honestly, I think has been more so at his best when they get him in kind of friendly yak situations or just trying to have him take the top off defenses. Pickens has been the one that's, again, just been that much better, I think, than Metcalf and honestly a lot of wide receivers in terms of turning those 50-50 contested catches into 80-20 propositions. But for both guys, Dwain, again, the problem just goes back to Arthur Smith and the reality that we're likely looking at another run-first offense. So going to be tough to be too high on either guy.
Yeah, for sure. And again, it will come down to the quarterback. Like if they don't sign one of Russell Wilson and Aaron Rodgers, like these guys are going to move down our ranks more. If they sign one of them, I'm not going to be moving either player much at all because I'm assuming right now in the ranks that they're getting one of those two quarterbacks.
So we'll see what happens there. Mason Rudolph, nice little stretch run to his tenure with the Steelers, but expecting that to continue for over the course of an entire season. Risky business, and I'm sure Steelers fans not looking to try to be a part of that. Dwayne, of course, never a dull day in the NFL calendar, and accordingly did have some news on Saturday we're getting to now, specifically starting off with the Chiefs getting the band back together, re-signed both Kareem Hunt and Juju Smith-Schuster to minimal one-year deals. So we'll kick things off with Kareem Hunt, and, hey, as we had going in that lovely intro, did make a habit of finding his way into the end zone last season. Now we can talk about his lack of explosive numbers, not exactly, ripping off big plays as a receiver these days either, but he did consistently get what was there, ended up having the league's third best success rate behind only Bijan Robinson and Derrick Henry. So look, good for Kareem Hunt. I don't think he's a bad running back or anything, especially in short yardage situations, but probably the bigger news here, Dwayne, is just, again, not saying we can't be a little bit excited about Kareem Hunt, but more than anything, very problematic for Isaiah Pacheco and potentially a rookie to be named later.
Yeah, and we can't forget, though, that Pacheco was playing with the same injury that we saw Mark Andrews try to come back from the year before. And this stuff can just take time. It's the same injury that hurt Tony Pollard in the year where he, everybody thought he'd be a top 6 running back and didn't work out. Yeah. And then ultimately he left the Cowboys and went to the Titans after that. So I think we got to be careful with Pacheco. Re-signing Kareem Hunt doesn't worry me that much. Elijah Mitchell is the guy that comes in that they bring over that does have a little bit more of that explosive playmaking ability. So like I could see this being a complete committee. But I still think Isaiah Pacheco should be the favorite to lead the backfield. Now, how confident am I in Isaiah Pacheco? Not that confident. Like I'm not moving him way up the ranks. I'm just calling out a caveat. He was playing with the injury. Kareem Hunt has really been, I hate to say this, but Kareem Hunt's been washed for 3 years. I don't really understand. Like, to your point, like, great, he got the yards that were there, but there's a lot of running backs that can do that. A lot of that really probably comes down more to the Chiefs' offensive line, right, than Kareem Hunt. So I don't know. I struggle a little bit with what the Chiefs are doing just with their moves in aggregate. Like, I'm like, man, there's not a difference-making move, right, that we've made yet. It's just kind of status quo, and we saw what happened to him in the Super Bowl against a much better roster from the Eagles.
And it's just that comfort level. I think that explains, honestly, both of these moves. Again, bringing back Kareem Hunt and Juju Smith-Schuster, Andy Reid, Patrick Mahomes. They're familiar with these guys, and accordingly, they're getting, again, more one-year deals to hopefully see what happens. So I don't want to completely, shoot down the Chiefs. Let's face it. They were, a bad 60 minutes of football away from clinching their third consecutive Super Bowl title. Still, even a lesser version, of course, no one in the AFC was good enough to take them down. But you just look at the Juju deal as well, Dwayne, and yes, I do think there's something there in terms of his ability to sit in the soft zones, be on the same page with Mahomes. Also had a nice performance against the Bills in the AFC Championship with 60 yards. But man, we're talking about a guy that in the last 2 regular seasons combined still only has 491 total receiving yards. So still a lot to be flushed out in terms of Xavier Worthy or Rashee Rice potentially being trouble with the NFL. But again, Juju is just one of these guys where I can almost call him a progress stopper, man, because it's not that I'm overly interested in what Juju's going to do, but as we saw down the stretch of last year, man, still enough belief in Kansas City for Juju to keep someone like DeAndre Hopkins off the field.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at Juju, we're not going to want him for fantasy football. Like, it's just not going to happen, man. But to your point, it's just enough to like water things down because they
Yeah.
rotate all the other guys. So we'll see what they do, in the draft. We'll see what other moves they might have up their sleeve. Obviously, to your point, they're kind of awaiting information now. We've added Xavier Worthy to the legal troubles as well to go along with Rashee Rice coming back from an injury as well as his own legal battles. They did bring back Hollywood Brown, so he's the clear winner right now. Hollywood didn't look as good as what we had seen from him in the past in the short sample we got at the end of the year, but the Chiefs did ramp up his playing time. His targets per route run was really good. The production never truly followed, but right now, I mean, Hollywood is the clear winner of the offseason for the Chiefs.
Now, two guys who we are going to be far more interested in come time to draft those fantasy rosters, Ja'Marr Chase and T. Higgins, both reportedly done deals in terms of staying with the Bengals for the long term. So specifically, guys, Bengals beat reporter James Rappian says that it is a done deal and that the Bengals are finalizing long-term extensions with both. Quote, everyone involved expects the deals to be finalized in the near future. Ja'Marr Chase will reportedly become the highest paid non-quarterback in NFL history. Meanwhile, T. Higgins is expecting to get a deal worth nearly $30 million per season. So Dwain, Joe Goodberry out there always does excellent work over on X, one of the best, Bengals beat reporters out there, in my humble opinion. He had a good line afterwards basically saying, wins? Maybe. Fun? Yes. So I think that's what we're dealing with here. Because again, you look at the Bengals last year, and I don't know how you can look at their current roster and say they're in a better position. But man, Joe Burrow, Ja'Marr Chase, and T. Higgins, I know we saw a lot of close game that the Bengals were on the wrong side of and everything. So this isn't like a lock to all of a sudden lead them to more success. But hey, man, they can score with anyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big winner here is obviously Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow, has been the QB2 last year, 23 fantasy points per game, 0.54 fantasy points per drop back. We got to skip 2025 because he was playing with an injury, only played 10 games. So we go back to 2022 and 2021. He was the QB4, averaging 22.7 fantasy points per game. So the last two full seasons we've seen from Joe Burrow, basically 23 fantasy points per game. You go back 1 year before that, 2021, he had 20.6 fantasy points per game. So when you've got Ja'Marr Chase, you've got T. Higgins, you got Joe Burrow playing in competitive games. The magic recipe last year for the Bengals, Ian, was the fact that their defense couldn't stop anybody. Their defense historically has been pretty good, but it wasn't good last year. So it just led to these games where Joe Burrow was doing what he had always done, which is play really well, score fantasy points. But whenever you're in these massive shootouts because your defense can't stop anybody, like you're having to keep the pedal to the metal like all the way to the end of the game. And that is what was really big for Joe Burrow last year, obviously kind of taking him to the absolute next level with 392 total fantasy points. So Burrow is interesting because, like, you look at the dual threat guys, Ian, obviously you're going to take them. You're looking at Lamar, you're looking at Josh Allen, you're looking at Jaden Daniels, Jalen Hurts. But right after that, I think maybe even in a tier of his own is Joe Burrow.
He's so fun to watch, man. I put together a little video the other day where, you hope that there's quarterbacks out there who are willing to step up into the pocket. You watch Joe Burrow, he's literally sprinting up into the pocket, man, taking these huge hits just to give his guys, again, that much longer to get open, and certainly helped, again, get his pair of stud wide receivers, all kinds of paid. Ja'Marr Chase, certainly deserving of, again, being the highest paid non-quarterback in NFL history, fresh off becoming just the fifth player to capture Triple Crown receiving honors in the last 50 years, joining Cooper Kupp, Steve Smith, Sterling Sharp, and yes, the GOAT himself, Jerry Rice. Meanwhile, T. Higgins just turned 26 in January, fresh off a career-high 10 touchdowns in just 12 games. Not too often you see, again, players 6'4", 216 pounds with Higgins' blend of contested catch goodness and yak beastliness. So Ja'Marr Chase, Dwain, very well could be Mr. 101 in fantasy drafts of most shapes and sizes ahead of this year. Where do you kind of fall with T. Higgins right now? Because looking at our ranks, there really does seem to be almost kind of a break after guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Malik Neighbors. You could argue Drake London, where, again, we have our guys ranked where we have them and everything. We have our preferences, but from about wide receiver 10 or wide receiver 11, you take those next 10 or so players, man. And again, if someone wanted to argue just flipping the order, I think you could, make that case.
Yeah, and I mean, we've all got T. Higgins as basically like a borderline wide receiver 1 right now. And when you look at him, obviously we look at Ja'Marr Chase as being the guy that we're going to lean to, is right, being the alpha there. But when you look at Higgins and what he did this last season, Ian, obviously, like, that's a great, data point as far as like what his ceiling can look like. And I think last year that's what we saw. Like T. Higgins really playing at that ceiling form. He averaged 18.7 fantasy points per game. The year before 11.5. The year before 13.7. His second year in the league was 15.7. Rookie season was at 12.3 fantasy points per game. So I do think he's due for a little regression. And as I was ranking him, I was kind of wondering, like, man, are we really buying into T. Higgins as this borderline wide receiver 2? His underlying data points really all stayed the same. He had a good yards per route run season. It was better than his previous two. But if you look at his targets per route run and things like that, really in line with his career averages. And what if the defense for the Bengals suddenly gets better? T. Higgins regresses a little bit in touchdowns. I think he could be more like a mid-range to low-end wide receiver too. So I'm kind of thinking, like, do I need to move T. Higgins down a little bit? The challenge becomes what you just said. You start looking at the next names on the list and you're like, man, I don't know. Like, am I really going to move T. Higgins down below these other 5 or 6 guys? I do think he's in a tier there where if I'm drafting 500 best ball teams, I'm not just going to take T. Higgins every time over that group that I've got sitting there where there's 3 or 4 other players just sitting right behind him. I would definitely be mixing it up because I do think there is a small chance here for some regression with T. Higgins versus what we saw last year.
Both wide receivers certainly had their fair share of, end zone opportunities, wound up combining for 27 receiving touchdowns. That was 7 more than the next most productive duos in the NFL. So again, not official quite yet, but certainly does seem like the Bengals at least have locked down Chase and Higgins for the long term. Trey Hendrickson now going to be up next. Also not official, Dwayne, is the Aaron Rodgers saga. We continue to go day by day waiting for this man to make up his mind. However, on Saturday, the Athletic's Mike Silver reported that Rodgers, quote unquote, hopes to sign with the Minnesota Vikings. Now, Dwayne, I hope that I'm going to make $100 million next year. I don't think exactly that's going to be the case. Would be pretty cool if it was. But when you just look at Rodgers and again, his most likely destinations, still feels like the Steelers and the Giants, unless maybe the Vikings haven't been totally forthcoming about, again, J.J. McCarthy's recovery from a pair of knee surgeries. That's the only reason, Dwayne, that I can even fathom they'd be interested in getting in the Rodgers business.
Yeah, it's the only one that I can as well. And, our good buddy Thor Nystrom's going to lose his mind if the Vikings sign Aaron Rodgers. If you guys haven't followed Thor over on Twitter, you know that Thor is an absolute. If you look up the word truther in the dictionary, you see a picture of Thor and JJ McCarthy next to each other. Like Thor is the absolute, the number one champion for JJ McCarthy. And at this point, like, because I follow Thor, I just want to see JJ McCarthy. I don't want to see Aaron Rodgers being, what we were just talking about earlier, Ian, was like, he's the guy that just basically keeps us from getting to see, the next thing. It's kind of like the Juju Smith-Schuster thing you were talking about. And we've got 2 other spots where we don't have a first-round quarterback from the previous season sitting there waiting to start with Pittsburgh and, also with the New York Giants. We've got other situations where, hey, I would feel better about at least Aaron Rodgers could stabilize the wide receivers there. So from the complete fantasy landscape, like being selfish, like I'd rather see Aaron Rodgers go to Pittsburgh or one of these other teams where we're hoping those wide receivers have at least a decent quarterback. And let's see what we have with J.J. McCarthy in Minnesota.
Again, basically at this point, there's obviously Pittsburgh, the New York Giants. You could argue the Minnesota Vikings are in the quarterback market, but assuming McCarthy's healthy, we're not quite going there. And then it's the Titans and probably the Cleveland Browns as the only other teams that, again, could actively be in the market to find their week 1 starter. The Titans certainly a candidate to, use that first overall pick on someone like Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders. But it does feel like one of these teams is going to get left out. Rodgers signs one place, Russ signs the next place, and the Browns are maybe starting, unironically starting Kenny Pickett in the year 2025, or we have Joe Flacco, Mr. Elite himself, coming in to save the day. So we'll see what happens. But again, this musical chairs of quarterbacks really does seem like it's going to screw over at least one team. Would not really count on Aaron making this a quick process, though. So let's talk about something, Dwayne, a bit more encouraging, and that is Mr. Matthew Friedman's updated mock draft. You guys can check it out for yourself over at fantasylife.com. Top 5 picks. He does actually have the Titans refraining from getting a quarterback, sticking with Penn State game-wrecking edge Abdul Carter going first overall. That leads to the Browns getting Cam Ward at number 2, the Giants getting Shedeur Sanders at number 3, but perhaps, Dwayne, most interesting, at least to me, a fantasy football savage over here, the Patriots getting Colorado wide receiver / cornerback Travis Hunter. So really does seem to be, a difference, honestly, from team to team on if they view Hunter being a full-time wide receiver or corner. But I know you've been in the weeds, again, trying to learn everything there is to know about these rookies, Dwayne, and God forbid we do get a full-time wide receiver role for Hunter. Could be special.
Yeah, Travis Hunter, like I get it. I get what people are worried about looking at the average draft position right now that's out there in the marketplace. They're thinking he's coming in as most likely starting as a cornerback for a team and having like a package of wide receiver plays. And that's it's very reasonable that is the outcome. However, I will just say if we're wrong about that, and the team that drafts him like really does see him as a wide receiver first, he has the talent profile, Ian, to be the best wide receiver in this class. He can truly beat you at all levels of the field. This is a guy that was really doing that while he was playing defense full time. Can you imagine if he's just playing some defense in the NFL, but being more of a full time player on offense? Like he doesn't quite reach the range of the top guys ever in the rookie supermodel. So you got to go back and got to look at guys like Jamar Chase, but a tier below that, right? So he comes in a range where if you look at it historically, if he were playing wide receiver full time, you're talking about a guy that almost 100% of the time would have at least been a wide receiver 3 by his third year in the NFL. And then more often than not, being that mid-range wide receiver 2, so talking about around 65% hit rate on guys turning into a mid-range wide receiver 2 that look like Travis Hunter, and obviously being upside to turn into that wide receiver 1. So yeah, if we heard he was going to be playing full-time wide receiver, I would be looking at him as being a guy we would want to project pretty quickly as being in the wide receiver 2 conversation with wide receiver 1 upside.
Honestly, I'm confused why Hunter's even letting this be a debate. Why doesn't he just stand up there and say, hey, guys, I'm a wide receiver. I'm going to play wide receiver because I want to make some money out here. Was preaching that about Brock Bowers and some of these guys over the past years because, again, not saying it's fair, but these wide receivers are making far more money than almost any other position at this point other than quarterback, edge rusher, and offensive tackles who, again, protecting and or getting after those quarterbacks. So maybe, just maybe, Drake May finally gets a real legit wide receiver 1 in Hunter. But Dwain, again, and Matthew Friedman's updated mock draft, the next most interesting spots for fantasy purposes do come between picks 6 and 8. Friedman has the Raiders taking Boise State stud RB Ashton Genty. Obviously, Chip Kelly now in town, leading Pete Carroll's offense for the Raiders. Would certainly be tough to move Genty too far down the ranks with the benefit of 300-plus touches. Certainly would seem like that be on the table. We also have the Jets selecting Penn State tight end Tyler Warren at pick 7, and the Panthers selecting Arizona wide receiver Tet McMillan over there at pick number 8. So how do you feel about these landing spots, Dwain? Because it does seem like there'd be plenty of opportunity there, albeit Raiders, Jets, Panthers, probably not going to be flirting with, the world's highest quarterback play.
Yeah, I mean, with the Raiders, you do get Geno Smith, and I think Geno Smith, like, while we don't think he's a top 12 quarterback, we definitely think that he's probably an underrated quarterback in the NFL. I think he's in the top 18. So I think the Raiders would be fine, man. If Genty goes to the Raiders, it's the wide open backfield. He's taking over. You've got another young great player there in Brock Bowers. You got a chain mover in Jacoby Myers. I think there's potentially a lot to like, with that landing spot. I've got Ashton Genty right now as my running back 4. You've got him running back 8. Friedman's got him running back 5. Waz is running back 5. So our consensus is running back 6 overall. So that tells you guys how much we already love Ashton Genty. And I'm really just, honestly, I'm leaning into the talent profile for Ashton Genty because he's one of the best that's ever been graded in the wide receiver, in the running back rookie supermodel. Like, he's right there alongside guys like Saquon Barkley. So 100% of the time, the guys that he comped to, Ian, have gone on to produce a top 6 fantasy season in their first 3 years. So I just, Genty, I'm not worrying too much about the landing spot. Obviously, there could be a run out where he slips in the draft a little bit and lands on a team that's got a really good incumbent starter. That would change things a little bit for us. But I'm assuming that he's not going to make it that far in the draft, and the Raiders would obviously fit the bill. As far as the other guys here, Tyler Warren obviously would have to battle the Justin Fields stuff. And now you got 2 guys vying for targets. You got Ty Warren and you got Garrett Wilson. Somebody's getting left out most likely with Justin Fields as the quarterback. So I wouldn't be crazy about that. I think it would be a good pick for the Jets, but I think that could be a little bit troublesome from a fantasy perspective. Tet McMillan, like, that's a really interesting one. And I think Friedman could be onto something here because, Adam Thielen, like, played really well last year, but he's old, Ian. If you look at Xavier Legette, he's a guy that the rookie supermodel did not like last year. Basically said, this guy's probably more of like a round 3 draft prospect, not a borderline, round 1 prospect, and didn't perform that well. So I think that's wide open. Really, the guy that surprised everybody the most was Jalen Coker, and it's not like he did anything that says he's guaranteed a spot. So yeah, I could see Tet McMillan going to the Panthers, and if he did land there, I would immediately project him by far as their wide receiver 1. Now, everything would come down to, and I know you just wrote some words about this, Ian, but Bryce Young. Like, what we saw at the end of last year, was it real or was it a fugazi? Hartitz. I tend to lean into, Young really looked good down the stretch. He's doing a lot of things we saw him be good at in college, and it was now translating to the NFL. We can't guarantee that Bryce Young is suddenly going to turn into a great quarterback, but I saw enough from him that I would be okay with Ted McMillan landing, with the Panthers.
Bryce Young, upon getting his job back in Week 8 through the end of the regular season, was actually tied with Joe Burrow for the league lead in PFF's big-time throws. Really was out there, again, making all kinds of great plays and really clutch at the end of games, too. I mean, if it wasn't for the Panthers, defense regularly collapsing, a missed field goal here or there, Leggett dropping that potential game winner against the Eagles, really could have been, a better second half of the year, even in the wins and losses department for the Panthers. So certainly, Bryce Young more than deserving of this, kind of third chance to really solidify himself as the franchise quarterback. But yeah, also don't love Dwain looking at, I think we can agree, a fairly mediocre, if we want to be nice, league average group of, wide receivers and everything. And yeah, just really haven't improved at all as we stand here halfway through free agencies. Continuing to break down all the biggest move from a chaotic week, you could say, of free agency in the NFL. But the thing is, Dwain, guess what? If you're really good at football, more times than not, you don't even make it to the open market in the first place. You get a nice old extension with your current employer, and that was the case for Mr. Chris Godwin. 3 years, $66 million to stay with the Buccaneers. However, it actually came out afterwards that the Patriots were reportedly willing to give him almost $20 million extra, but Godwin was good staying down there in Florida. So, I am not a doctor or a data scientist, Dwain, but I'm pretty sure that no income tax in Florida still wouldn't be making up that $20 million gap. Just goes to show Godwin must be thrilled about his current situation with Baker Mayfield and company, and accordingly, hopefully he's ready to once again supply some fantasy fireworks in 2025 and beyond.
Yeah, career high last year. Obviously, only got to play the 7 games, smaller sample, but 2.36 yards per route run. Ian, also a career high in targets per route run at 25%. And the thing that really clicked for him, historically, Godwin has also always been a guy that would get the targets against the zone coverage, right? Makes sense. Typically playing the Z, playing inside, is going to be the one who knows how to sit down in the zone against those inside defenders. You often get a mismatch. So you see those sort of things. But last year, what really unlocked things for him, man coverage. Targets per route run, 26%, a career high. So Baker Mayfield, whenever he saw that single coverage with Chris Godwin, he was just much more willing to go to him than what we had seen historically going back with Tom Brady, where it's everything, with Brady. And Brady was great, but he wasn't going to force really anything. He's going to let the coverage dictate things. And so last year, we just really saw Baker latch on to Chris Godwin in those man coverage scenarios. And, you've mentioned it in some of your great stuff that you've written over at Fantasy Life recently. But if you go back and look at those first 7 games, guys, you look how good Chris Godwin was playing. And we're talking about a top 5 fantasy wide receiver. So I think there's a lot of things to feel good about here. Now, Godwin, if you look at the history of his career, Ian, he has been one of these guys that has a tendency to bounce around a little bit. Last year, 19.7 points per game in a PPR. Year before, 12.2. Year before, 15. Year before, 18. So we've got 2 years where we've been essentially at 18 or higher. And then you go back 2 years before that, and he had a 20. But in between he had a 16. So he's bounced around a tad, but he's a wide receiver 2, period. That's still getting drafted too late in fantasy drafts. And he has wide receiver 1 upside. He's actually shown us that in multiple seasons at this point. So yeah, I am on board with Chris Godwin. The injury that he's come back was a dislocated ankle. Everything sounds really good on that front. We're not talking about coming back from an ACL or an MCL where you have to be worried about, man, is it half a year before he even feels like 80%? I don't think we're going to have to worry about that here. Obviously, we'll have to keep tabs on it throughout the preseason. But man, Chris Godwin, I think, has been one of the most underdrafted wide receivers to this point on Underdog, if you guys are out there in the best ball streets.
From the doctors themselves, Dr. Deepak Chona does believe Godwin will likely be playing in week 1 of next season. Did note that wide receiver ankle data favors a moderate dip that should recover around mid-season, but yes, certainly doesn't seem like he's a candidate for the pup or anything of that nature. So yes, Dwayne, losing Liam Cohen to the Jaguars is not ideal, but they did promote from within. Josh Grizzard was the team's pass game coordinator in 2024, was previously with the Dolphins, between 2017 and 2023. So I'm with you. And again, I don't want to be the boy who cried too high of ADP in March or anything. This stuff is going to figure itself out. But to see Godwin just being insulted as this borderline wide receiver 3 almost could not be me. Right now, he's my wide receiver 22, same tier as guys like DJ Moore, Cortland Sutton, Marvin Harrison Jr., Chris Olave, amongst others. So it's one of those things where, yes, Mike Evans is still going to be getting his, but they complement each other so nicely, Dwayne, with what they're asked to do. And man, just talking about guys who, again, that ceiling floor combo. And I don't want to say that Godwin doesn't have a ceiling. I mean, my goodness, only Jamar Chase had more PPR points than the guy first 7 weeks of last season. But man, if you just had to guess, like, all right, you get one shot, like Evans or Godwin, which one is for sure going to finish inside the top 24? I mean, just the easier nature, the yak friendly, screens and everything that Godwin gets, he's going to have every chance to do so.
Yeah, I think you could make an argument, that it's Godwin. I mean, both these guys have been really good players, and you mentioned it. They complement each other so well, right? They both do very different things, and I do think having a quarterback, of the Baker archetype, which is, hey, I'm just going to really just throw it to these two dudes for the most part, and I'm not afraid to do it against man covers, zone covers, doesn't really matter. I think that's really good for Godwin, because if we go back to that other biggest year that we talked about, where he averaged almost 20 fantasy points per game, who was his quarterback? It was Jameis. It was Jameis Winston. So I think when you look at this scenario, like with Godwin, he's one of these guys that he's just underrated, and Baker really likes him. So yeah, I could see leaning towards Chris Godwin actually being the one that, if you made me choose as the guy that I had to pick between the two. He is younger, right? I mean, he'll be 29 when the season starts. Evans is ahead of him there. So yeah, I could lean to Godwin. Look, I like both of them. I think I have them back to back in my ranks. So I think I was actually a chicken, because I think I was asking myself this question, and I was like, I'm just going to put them right next to each other.
Certainly great news for Baker Mayfield to have his two top dogs back either way. And Baker Mayfield, #1 in the entire NFL in passing touchdowns over the past 2 years. Just goes to show you guys, again, anything is possible in your life once you decide to finally leave Cleveland. Talking about, again, just some good, yaksters taking those low 1-2 yard targets, the distance sometimes, Dwayne. Mr. Deebo Samuel has been traded to the Washington Commanders. Now, wasn't exactly, supplying those big plays as frequently in 2024. Things were getting ugly at the end, but maybe not enough was put into the reality that this guy was dealing with a rib issue during the first part of the year, and then had pneumonia to the point that he was hospitalized for several days, again, after about week 6 or 7. So earlier on in the year, first 6 games, he was actually the wide receiver 25 in PPR points per game. Still a far cry from what we were used to seeing, but man, after that illness, just a wide receiver 54 during the second half of the season. So hopefully, Dwayne, we see Deebo getting healthier and at least somewhat resembling the guy that we saw serving as one of the most electric players at, honestly, wide receiver and running back during the previous 4 years. And really, when you look at the fit here in Washington and some of the things that Cliff Kingsbury likes to do, not guaranteeing Deebo's going to all of a sudden get back to partying like it's 2021. But if you had to go ahead and rank these landing spots, Commanders would have been near the top of the list.
Yeah, I think Commanders would have been at the top of the list, right? I think you could have said a place like the Rams, where Sean McVay knows how to manufacture those touches behind the line of scrimmage and things like that. That would be in the mix as well. But when you look at what Cliff Kingsbury likes to do and all the targets around the line of scrimmage, Deebo's going to take those. And that's going to free Terry McLaurin up, who got a lot of those last year, to do some different things. He then becomes complementary in nature to Terry McLaurin. And then when you think about it, you've got Jaden Daniels running this RPO stuff, Ian, right? Like, does he hand it to a running back? Does he keep it for himself, or does he pop it outside to Deebo Samuel? Like, that's kind of nice 3 options to have. So I think Deebo's in a really good spot here. To your point, we don't know if Deebo Samuel is washed or not, but I think you do have to at least caveat it, like you did, talking about what we saw with pneumonia last year and how much of that was a factor. Because if you look at his yards after the catch, it's not like they cratered. He went from 8.7 to 8.2. The thing that went down was his targets per route run, which pulled his yards per route run down. They just decided to go more to guys like Jawan Jennings and some of these other players. So I think if you were talking about Deebo Samuel potentially being able to get back to the form that we saw from him in the past, this is one of 2 or 3 landing spots that, like, it's at least open. The avenue is open to him, because I do believe Kingsbury will use him in a very similar way to what we saw in San Francisco. And that wasn't going to be a guarantee anywhere else that he landed. So I feel like he's pretty much a lock to, at least to start the season, get those kind of looks. Now, what does Deebo do with those looks? And is he actually making it pay off? that is what will really determine, like, does he get to continue to have those opportunities as the season goes along?
Unlike the Cooper Kupp marriage in Seattle, I think this is honestly closer to what we were just talking about in Tampa Bay in terms of having two wide receivers in Terry McLaurin and Deebo Samuel who really do complement each other nicely and not going to be a situation where they're, eating into each other's targets. Should be more than enough to go around again with one of the rising, ascending best young quarterbacks in the game and Jaden Daniels at the forefront of all that. I've been going through all the positions that have been impacted by free agency, trades, and whatnot over the last week in the NFL. Quarterback, running back, wide receiver, good times were had. But Dwain, now we are on the tight end where really just looking at the class before anything went down, it was easily kind of the weakest in terms of just big names and players who we thought could actually walk into a new environment and contribute anything close to fantasy relevant numbers. But then the Jaguars decided to purge things, had a lot of free agents come to fruition, none bigger than Mr. Evan Ingram, who went ahead and took his talents to Denver, signed a 2-year, $23 million deal with the Broncos. 16.5 of that is fully guaranteed. So one of these things where, again, over the course of these past few off seasons, cannot listen to a single Sean Payton press conference without hearing about him wanting this joker, a running back or tight end hybrid who's just able to line up in different spots and really feast in the lower areas of the field. And the hope was that Greg Dulcich could be that guy, but spoiler, he was not. And now Evan Ingram is being, paid to do so. So Ingram certainly leaning into it. He was, tweeting out a gif of Heath Ledger's Joker over on the old Twitter sphere the other day. So love seeing that he's into it. And look, even if Ingram isn't this top 5 talent at the position, we have seen him, Dwain, provide some pretty nice heights in fantasy land, something that just based on the lack of target competition in Denver seems to be on the table in 2025.
Yeah, I think the big thing, like, it could be a challenge for Evan Ingram. Obviously, we love Sean Payton. We love what we've seen him do at times in the past, like a Jimmy Graham. We would love that. But with Evan Ingram, man, like looking at his route participation rates, obviously last year, he was injured. But if you start adjusting, for the injuries, 75%, that's really good. 87% the year before. I mean, that's elite. And then 80% the year before that. So in Jacksonville, this was a guy that just was on the field anytime this team was throwing the ball for the most part. Will he get that same treatment in Sean Payton's offense? Because that's the huge thing for the tight ends. They've got to be on the field enough to make a meaningful contribution for fantasy managers. And Sean Payton historically has been a guy that has been very willing to rotate guys. Now, Evan Ingram is going to be one of the better tight ends that he's had, in the last 10 seasons. So I lean towards him, giving him the playing time. But it is interesting because some of his success, with the tight end position has come from really creating these route combinations with the running backs, where you've got the tight end really, working the vertical interior of the defense, and then you've got the running back coming back in behind that. Ian, I know you love this on a Texas route or an angle route. You got a guy like Alvin Kamara going back in the days to Darren Sproles, like, and making those combinations together. Evan Ingram is not really shown to be a guy, even though, like, when you look at him athletically, you would think he could do this. He's been really more of a around the line of scrimmage kind of player, right? Yeah. His average depth of target the last 3 years with the Jaguars, 6.4, 5.0, 5.8. That's low. Like, this is a guy running drag routes, running away from man coverage, linebackers, flooding zones, doing different things like that. He hasn't been that vertical threat. So very interested to see, like, conceptually, like, how Sean Payton integrates him into the offense. But the biggest thing really will come down to that playing time, because if it ends up being a deal where it's like 60% route participation, that is going to be that's going to disrupt the fantasy value of Evan Ingram, even if they get the scheme part of it figured out. I think the good news is right now, most people can't name any of the tight ends that are on the Broncos. So I feel like Evan Ingram's going to have the inside playing track here. I just think there's more risk to him in Denver, in my opinion, than had he stayed with the Jaguars.
It's not just a clean, okay, Ingram's going to fill this role and we're good to go situation, because over these last 2 years, I mean, Denver tight ends dead last in the NFL by 37 targets overall. Meanwhile, their running backs have been first. So again, that was existing on a roster that did not have someone like Evan Ingram. You mentioned that Sean Payton over the years has had guys like Jimmy Graham certainly be far more involved in the offense. But we've also seen years where Greg Dulcich couldn't do anything even when he was healthy enough, where they gave Kobe Fleener a bunch of money and he couldn't do do anything there. God, just reopening some fantasy scars from a decade
You
ago,
are.
Dwayne. It hurts. But again, a situation where I would think they have a plan for Ingram. They obviously gave him all that money for a reason. So I am optimistic, but certainly not a situation I think where we can just full confidence, 100% rank him as a top 6 guy from day one. But all that to say, man, you do look at kind of the tight end landscape ahead of next year. If I had to guess, there should be a fairly common consensus top 5 tight ends between Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, George Kittle, Sam Laporta, and TJ Hawkinson. But after that, it gets interesting. And I do think you could make a case for Ingram being that next guy up, even if you aren't that high on him. Still tough to dispute that he deserves to be in that next tier with guys like Andrews, Kelsey, Njoku, and the Jonnu Smiths of the world.
Yeah, I mean, you're a little higher than me. You're tight end 9. I've got him tight end 11. Friedman's 13. Waz is at tight end 14. So we're all in that, okay, borderline tight end 1 territory. Again, if he was coming back with Jacksonville, like I would have no problem having him in my top 7 or 8. I would feel pretty comfortable about it. But right now with Denver, it's a little bit more of a concern. Like if he was in Jacksonville, we just saw Liam Cohen basically leave Cade Otton out there, all the time. Now Cade Otton's a different player, right, than Evan Ingram. So there could have been some risks that, with the Jaguars as well. But I think low end tight end 1 is fair. But if he does somehow get the same kind of role that he had in Jacksonville as far as playing time, he would end up being a value because he's a good enough player to be that mid-range tight end 1 if he's getting the route participation that we want.
2 other big moves at the position in free agency really were just the re-signings of Zach Ertz with Washington. Sorry to all the Ben Sinnott truthers out there. And then also Mike Gesicki coming back to the Bengals on a surprisingly, steep deal, seeing him actually be able to get, again, 3 years with north of $25 million there. So good for them, Dwayne. But that said, kind of already saw what those offenses looked like last year. Really, you could argue, other than Ingram, the real big winner at the position is Ingram's former backup, Brenton Strange, now profiling as the tight end 1 in Jacksonville. So Penn State product has flashed with his opportunities over the years. And man, you start looking at this Jaguars offense, with all due respect to Diami Brown, certainly doesn't seem like there's a bunch of target competition outside of Brian Thomas Jr., of course. So do you think, Dwayne, there's a chance for Strange to actually emerge as one of, the better later round dart throws at the position?
Yeah, I mean, you and I both got him as a mid-range tight end 2, but I think he has mid-range tight end 1 upside. We both have him as tight end 17. I think we dared each other on a show last week of who would go higher, and we just ended up the same. I'm just now looking at this. Waz is way lower, tight end 28. Friedman doesn't even know that Brenton Strange exists. He's got him as tight end 45, so we're going to have a talk with Mr. Matthew Friedman about his ranks after the show. But looking at Brenton Strange, man, you mentioned it. Like, he's only a third-year player. He was a second-round pick out of Penn State, pick 61 in that draft in 2023. And if we look at what he did last year, targets per route run, 20%, yards per route run, 1.49. So those are tight end 1 territory. Again, small sample. Played in the 17 games, but didn't get to play as, it was actually a decent sample, 551 snaps, 276 routes. But I would say, like, on the routes, we would want to see someone more at like 450, 500 to feel really comfortable. Things do tend to stabilize on most of these stats around 250 routes. So he was just over that at 276, but still pretty small. But it's in that territory of young player. The opportunity's definitely there. We've got a coordinator that we like. We've got a quarterback that we know can, Trevor Lawrence, like, you can call him what you want as far as whether you think he's been, he lived up to his draft expectations. I think everyone would say no, but I don't think any of us think Trevor Lawrence is a bad quarterback, right? Yeah. We think he can support fantasy weapons. So I think there's a lot of things going for Brenton Strange. So yeah, I do think he will be one of the today, again, draft still has to happen, but today I think he is one of the best late round picks at tight end. And if you can get him in your underdog drafts, things like that, yeah, I like it a lot.
Evan Ingram worked as the tight end 8 in terms of PPR points per game during these last 3 seasons in Jacksonville. And obviously, Liam Cohen had Cade Otton absolutely feasting for stretches of last season, especially during those 3 or 4 games where both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin were sidelined. So maybe, just maybe, Brenton Strange will be the next man up to be racking up some of that production. And again, right now, so cheap in fantasy drafts that can't hurt to find out with one of those late round picks. Appreciate you guys joining in. It's Ian Hartitz and Dwain McFarland. We've been breaking down some free agency goodness. But you know what? Let's turn our heads to the draft and start to get eyeballs on some of these 20-somethings that will come in and inevitably help swing some of our fantasy championships in 2025 and beyond. So if you guys don't know, well, now you do. Dwain McFarland's wide receiver rookie supermodel is live over on fantasylife.com. And Dwayne, again, just magnificent job by you, my friend. If you guys look at it, again, we are weighting everything from their age to their potential draft pick rating, program quality rating, film rating, and production. Again, so many different categories go into this. And accordingly, we get our supermodel rating. So, Dwayne, at the top, again, probably not surprising anyone to see Ted McMillan and Travis Hunter taking the top 2 spots, but already hearing a lot of different opinions, I should say, on Missouri wide receiver Luther Burden. Talk about some of the challenges you've seen when it comes to, again, just how he was used at Missouri and maybe some of that drop off in production from 2023 compared to last season.
Yeah, so if you look at it overall, like what the model is doing is it actually is adjusting for their age and how much they're producing. So their production rating in the supermodel, they get more weight if they break out early in their collegiate career. However, it's a blend, right? So even though he did drop down in that 3rd season, Luther Burden, his receiving yards per team pass attempt, for example, the model's not like overly concerned about it because it's looking at his first 3 years that it cares about the most. The thing that you hear most people talk about with Luther Burden, Ian, and they talk about their concerns is the fact that 32% of his targets came behind the line of scrimmage, right? And so you immediately start thinking of players like Rondell Moore. There's a bunch of examples, Laviska Shenault. There's a bunch of examples that we could go into, and only 35% of his snaps actually came out wide. So he mostly played in the slot and he played underneath. But here's the challenge with that, right? We don't know for sure what's going on with a player like Burden. Is it because he couldn't do other things, or is it because, hey, you didn't trust your quarterback and you just want to design as easy of touches as possible to get the ball to your best playmaker on your team? He was a 5-star recruit. And so a big part of what goes into the supermodel is also using a film rating. And we use NFL.com, Lance Zierlein, because he's got his grades out going back, multiple years. I've looked at him back to 2014. Very strong correlation with future performance in the NFL. So that's what we're using for film. And when you look at what Zierlein had to say about him, like he says, Missouri exploited Burden's yards after the catch talent with a barrage of short throws, but NFL teams are much more likely to diversify his usage, activating his complete skill set and big play potential. So, i.e., I watched all of his routes, and he actually has an ability to stretch other areas of the field. It just wasn't how he got used in college. And that's always the big question with any of these things. And it's like, okay, this is what they did in college, but is that for sure what determines what they will be in the pros? And so there's some projection going on here with Luther Burden. You definitely have to believe in the fact that he can do more than what he did in college. But guess what, Ian? We have a really easy way to determine that. Where does he go in the NFL draft? Well, right now, if you look at it, he's projected to go at pick 25. So I'm going to just give you some names here. They were very close to where Burden was in college. What if I told you with Brandon Ayuk, he had 29% of his targets behind the line of scrimmage? Remember Burden at 32%? 22% of his targets came 20-plus yards down the field. Burden, 21%. Where did Brandon Ayuk go in the NFL draft? Pick 25. So the NFL team is telling you when they draft a player, if they think he can actually take the next step forward. If you look at the guys that haven't worked out, that had a similar profile to Burden, Ian, it's been guys that have fallen in the NFL draft. So that's the signal teams are actually telling you, no, we actually do think he was just manufactured a bunch of touches in college. And we're not sure he can do it at the next level, so we're not going to spend a first-round pick on that kind of player. So the closest comps I had for him in the model were Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, and the low end would be Laviska Shenault. So not saying he's a guarantee, but 63% of the players that comped in the same range as him, Ian, went on to have a top 36 fantasy finish in their first 3 years. 53% of them turned into wide receiver 2s, and 16% turned into wide receiver 1s. This is based on data back to 2018. So those are really strong numbers for a wide receiver. So I feel good about Burden. I think, as a prospect, he is a borderline wide receiver 2, if you look at what's happened for guys that have been similar to him historically.
And just some of these potential landing spots at the bottom of round 1. I mean, I do wonder if it could almost be a Lab McConkey-esque, scenario where I understand, he wasn't going in the same range. But look, when you do make it past the top 20 picks, okay, now you're dealing with playoff teams that have a lot more stability under center, as opposed to if you're going inside the top 10. So looking at, again, Houston at pick 25, I know Christian Kirk is their slot for now, but maybe doesn't mean they're exactly, out of the Luther Burden sweepstakes. The Rams, the Ravens, the Lions, the the Commanders, the Bills, the Chiefs, the Eagles. I mean, again, we could really be excited about some of those landing spots. And I do think sometimes, Dwayne, there's this misconception with guys like Burden where they get these design touches and we just want to say, oh, he's a gadget. I mean, we'll take those design touches 8 days of the week as long as they don't come at the expense of a normal full-time role. So someone like Burden, who obviously was the engine of that Missouri offense over the last 2 years, would not be so quick to assume that he can't do more. Certainly going to have every opportunity to do so, given that he is fully expecting to be picked inside at least, I would say, the top 35, top 40 selections. So good stuff on Burden, who comes in as your wide receiver 3. Right behind him, though, Dwayne, we do have Emeka Egbuka and Matthew Golden. Very similar overall ratings. I'm sure if one goes a bit higher in the draft than expected, that could change things here. But thoughts on maybe an early lean between the Ohio State and Texas products?
I lean Egbuka. I just, his production ratings and 84 in the model is just stronger than what we got. Like, he checks more boxes. But I could see an NFL team falling in love with Matthew Golden and the speed and him going ahead of Egbuka. The big knock on Egbuka, Ian, and you know this, you're the big Ohio State fan, only 25% of snaps came out wide. I do think he looks more like a slot wide receiver, kind of like JSN early in his career at least. And if you look at him, man, only 12% of his targets came 20 plus yards down the field. That's the lowest of anyone we're expecting to go in the first 3 rounds of this NFL draft. So you worry a little bit about his ability to do things downfield, which means he probably needs to land somewhere that's going to play 3 wide receivers all the time, and it's a pass-first offense. Like, that would be the optimal landing spot for an Egbuka. But the model does acknowledge the fact that he played with Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Marvin Harrison, and then Jeremiah Smith. These are all first-round NFL draft picks. I know Jeremiah Smith not there yet, but he's going to be one, folks. Like, it's going to happen.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, Egbuka doing what he did at Ohio State, playing in that kind of program, it really does help him in the model. So I think he's a guy that also profiles as a wide receiver too for fantasy in the future. Not quite the same ceiling though that you potentially get with Burden and then the guys that come in the tier above him with McMillan and Travis Hunter.
Invite you guys to check out, again, the rest of Dwayne's supermodel over on fantasylife.com. Rounding out the top 10, we have Ole Miss wide receiver Trey Harris, Stanford wide receiver Alec Ao Manor. I'll work on that pronunciation. A couple of Iowa State guys, and then also Texas wide receiver Isaiah Bond. So, again, really does seem like a big 5, but a situation where there'll be plenty of big names going in day 2 as well. So, hope you guys, again, have enjoyed hearing your boy Ian and Dwayne on Fantasy Life Radio here. Stay tuned. Plenty more on the way, though. Sirius XM Fantasy Sports Radio. Happy Sunday. Make it a great one. We're out of here.